In the heart of the Middle East, where empires have risen and fallen for thousands of years, one man's ambition would reshape an entire nation and lead it into decades of war, fear, and bloodshed. This is the story of Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, revolutionary and executioner. To understand Saddam, you have to begin in the small town of Al-Auja, near Tikrit, where he was born in 1937. A boy raised in poverty, born into violence, his father gone before he was born and his mother consumed by despair. From these harsh beginnings grew a man obsessed with power and control. By his teenage years, Saddam was already drawn to politics, specifically the Ba'ath Party, a revolutionary movement that dreamed of a unified Arab world. Its message of nationalism and strength appealed deeply to a young man who had known only weakness. But ambition is never simple in Iraq. In 1959, Saddam joined a small group of conspirators in an attempt to assassinate Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim, the man who had overthrown the Iraqi monarchy just 1 year earlier. The attempt failed, and Saddam barely escaped with his life. Wounded, hunted, and on the run, he fled to Egypt, where he would spend years studying law, politics, and revolution. This time in exile hardened him. When he returned to Iraq in the mid-1960s, Saddam was no longer a follower. He was a man preparing to rule. The Ba'ath Party took power in 1968 through a military coup, and behind the scenes, Saddam was already pulling strings, building alliances, creating a network of loyalty and fear. Within a decade, he would eliminate every rival, every obstacle, every threat. In July 1979, Saddam Hussein became the president of Iraq. What followed would become one of the most brutal dictatorships in modern history, a reign marked by paranoia, propaganda, and endless war. On the morning of July 17, 1968, gunfire echoed through the streets of Baghdad. A coup was underway. The Ba'ath Party, after years of failed revolutions and political turmoil, had seized control of Iraq once again. But behind the scenes, a young deputy named Saddam Hussein was already emerging as the real architect of this power grab. Though the official head of state was Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam was his cousin, his protege, and, increasingly, the man holding the true reins of power. Saddam didn't rise through charisma or military genius. His power came from something far more dangerous: control over fear. He built an intelligence network, the Mukhabarat, that reached into every corner of Iraqi life. Neighbors watched neighbors. Officers spied on their own families. A whisper against the regime could end in disappearance. To the outside world, Saddam projected an image of modernity. Iraq was flush with oil wealth, and in the 1970s he launched ambitious programs: free education, universal healthcare, massive construction projects. Baghdad's skyline rose higher than ever before. To many Iraqis, it seemed like a new golden age was beginning. But beneath that progress lay terror. Every teacher, every bureaucrat, every general knew that loyalty to Saddam was not optional. It was survival. By the late 1970s, President al-Bakr was old and in failing health. Saddam had quietly taken control of the party, the army, and the security forces. In July 1979, he forced al-Bakr to resign, officially for health reasons. But everyone in Iraq knew the truth. Saddam Hussein was now the undisputed ruler. Days after taking office, Saddam gathered hundreds of senior Ba'ath officials in a hall in Baghdad. Cameras rolled as he stood at the podium, smiling, confident, dressed in military green. Then suddenly he announced that a conspiracy against him had been uncovered. Names were read aloud, one by one, as the accused men were dragged out by guards. Some begged for mercy, others fainted. By the end of the day, dozens were executed. It was a terrifying message. The new president would tolerate no dissent.
Walid Saleh Muhammad, Daz Ibrahim Ayoub, Ghassan Marhoun, Ahmed Ibrahim Saleh, Muhammad Manaf al-Yasin. اللي يقرأ اسمه يردد شعار الحزب ويغادر القاعة. حسن محمود طه، حميد عبد اللطيف، خالد عبد عثمان، أمجد هاشم مصطفى الجباري، علي فتحي علوش، بدر محمد عبد الله، كردي سعيد عبد الباقي، إحسان وفيق عبد الله السامرائي، محمود جاسم رجب، نافع حسين علي الكويسي، وليد سيرت، عبد الرحمن الهنداوي، غانم نافع الكويسي، بدن فاضل مؤيد عبد الله، طالب الصويلح، اسماعيل النجار.
In just one televised event, Saddam Hussein had transformed fear into absolute power. From that moment on, Iraq no longer had a leader, it had a dictator. The cult of personality began. His portraits covered every building. Schoolchildren recited his name like scripture. His image appeared on banknotes, murals, even wedding halls. To his followers, he was the father of the nation. To his enemies, a ghost they feared even to name. Saddam Hussein's rise to power was complete. But maintaining power in Iraq, a land divided by tribes, sects, and ambitions, would require something far greater than politics. It would require fear. Under Saddam's rule, Iraq became a state of surveillance and silence. The Mukhabarat, his secret police, watched everything. They listened to every phone call, infiltrated every neighborhood, and filled prison cells with anyone accused of disloyalty, real or imagined. Torture chambers became the regime's dark heartbeat. Political prisoners vanished overnight. Even members of Saddam's own family weren't safe. He ruled with absolute control, but also with calculation. Each act of brutality sent a message. Betrayal would not be forgiven. Yet for all the fear, the 1980s began with the illusion of prosperity. Iraq's oil industry was booming, bringing in billions of dollars. Saddam poured that money into modernizing the country, building highways, schools, and hospitals. To many Iraqis, he was not a tyrant, but a savior. He presented himself as the guardian of Arab unity, the man who would restore Iraq's glory and lead the Arab world against its enemies. And soon he found the perfect opportunity to prove it. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein launched an invasion of neighboring Iran. His goal, to strike while Iran was weak, reeling from the chaos of the Islamic Revolution. Saddam believed the war would last only weeks, a quick victory that would cement him as the Middle East's strongest leader. He was wrong. The war turned into a brutal 8-year stalemate, one of the longest and deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. Over 1 million people died. Entire towns were wiped from the map, and both sides used weapons of unimaginable horror. Saddam's forces used chemical weapons, mustard gas and nerve agents, not only against Iranian troops, but also against his own citizens. In 1988, in the Kurdish town of Halabja, Iraqi jets dropped poison gas that killed over 5,000 civilians, men, women, and children. It was one of the darkest moments in Iraq's history, a crime the world would never forget. Despite the atrocities, many Western nations, including the United States, quietly supported Saddam. Why? Because Iran was their greater enemy. Saddam, they believed, was the lesser evil, a brutal dictator but a useful one. The US supplied intelligence, and European companies provided weapons and materials. The world turned a blind eye as Iraq's war machine grew stronger. When the war finally ended in 1988, Iraq was broken, its economy shattered, its people exhausted. Yet Saddam declared victory. Statues were raised, medals awarded, and propaganda filled the airwaves. But privately, Saddam knew the truth. He had gained nothing. Iraq was deeply in debt, owing billions to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Oil revenues had collapsed. His regime was running out of money, and his army, once loyal, was restless. In his desperation, Saddam began to look south, toward his small, wealthy neighbor, a nation that in his eyes had cheated Iraq out of its rightful wealth. The seeds of the next war had been planted. The 1980s had made Saddam Hussein a symbol of defiance in the Arab world and a monster in the eyes of his victims. But the 1990s would bring something even he could not control, the beginning of the end. It was the summer of 1990. The Iran-Iraq war had drained Iraq's treasury and left the country buried in debt. Saddam Hussein believed that Kuwait, his small oil-rich neighbor, was conspiring against him, flooding the oil market and keeping prices low. To Saddam, this wasn't just economics, it was betrayal. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces stormed into Kuwait. Within hours, the tiny nation was overrun. Kuwait City fell in a single day. The world watched in shock as Iraq, once an ally of the West, became an international pariah. Saddam declared Kuwait to be Iraq's 19th province. He miscalculated. The invasion united nearly the entire world against him. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, built a massive international coalition. Over 30 nations joined, sending 500,000 troops to Saudi Arabia in what became Operation Desert Storm. Saddam's army, one of the largest in the Middle East, was about to face the most advanced military force on Earth. In January 1991, the bombing began. The skies over Baghdad turned to fire. For 43 days, US and Allied warplanes unleashed more than 88,000 tons of bombs, destroying power grids, bridges, and command centers. Iraqi television broadcast Saddam appearing calm, smoking cigars, promising victory. But in reality, his army was collapsing. After just 100 hours of ground combat, the war was over. Kuwait was liberated. Iraq's military lay in ruins. Yet the coalition stopped short of removing Saddam from power. Washington feared chaos, that Iraq might splinter, that Iran might expand its influence. So Saddam survived, wounded, humiliated, but alive. In the war's aftermath, uprisings erupted across Iraq. In the south, Shia Muslims rose against Saddam's rule. In the north, the Kurds declared rebellion. Encouraged by Western broadcasts, they believed US forces would help them. Help never came. Saddam's army returned with vengeance. Tens of thousands were killed. Entire villages were flattened. Mass graves spread across the desert. By summer, the revolts were crushed, and Saddam's grip on power was restored. But Iraq's victory was hollow. The United Nations imposed some of the harshest economic sanctions in modern history. For ordinary Iraqis, life became unbearable. Food and medicine grew scarce. Electricity failed. Yet Saddam and his inner circle lived in palaces of marble and gold. He built over 80 palaces, even as his people starved. Propaganda filled state television, Saddam visiting hospitals, hugging children, declaring that Iraq would endure. To his supporters, he was still the strongman who defied the West. To the rest of the world, he had become a symbol of cruelty and defiance. After the Gulf War, Saddam was ordered to destroy his weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear. UN inspectors searched for proof. Sometimes they found evidence, sometimes they were blocked. Saddam played a dangerous game, bluffing about his arsenal to appear strong, even when much of it had been destroyed. That bluff would later cost him everything. After the September 11th attacks in 2001, the United States entered a new era of fear and vengeance. President George W. Bush labeled Saddam Hussein part of an axis of evil. Washington accused Iraq of hiding weapons of mass destruction and of supporting terrorism. Neither claim would ever be proven, but the decision had been made.
They have delivered public and private messages urging the dictator to leave Iraq so that disarmament can proceed peacefully. He has thus far refused. All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
On March 20th, 2003, the United States and its allies launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Baghdad was bombed relentlessly. Columns of tanks rolled across the border. Within 3 weeks, the regime collapsed. Saddam's 24-year rule ended as quickly as it began, in fire and chaos. But the man himself had vanished. Baghdad had fallen. US troops roamed the capital. Government ministries were in flames. Looters stripped palaces bare. The man who once ruled Iraq with an iron fist had disappeared, a ghost in the desert. Coalition forces scoured the country. Each day brought rumors. Saddam seen near Tikrit, Saddam hiding in Syria, Saddam dead. None were true. He was still in Iraq. The Americans called it Operation Red Dawn. For months, special operations teams followed whispers from informants, captured family members, interrogated guards. Finally, on December 13, 2003, intelligence pointed them to a small farm near Ad-Dawa, just outside Saddam's hometown, Tikrit. Beneath the dirt, hidden in a narrow underground hole, barely big enough to lie down, they found him, disheveled, bearded, exhausted. The once mighty dictator emerged silently into the light.
December the 13th, at around 8:30 p.m. Baghdad time, United States military forces captured Saddam Hussein alive. He was found near a farmhouse outside the city of Tikrit in a swift raid conducted without casualties. And now the former dictator of Iraq will face the justice he denied to millions.
His empire was gone. His sons, Uday and Qusay, had been killed months earlier in a firefight. His loyalists were scattered. The man who built a cult of invincibility was now a prisoner of war. In 2004, Saddam Hussein was handed over to the Iraqi interim government to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Cameras broadcast his image worldwide. Gone was the uniformed strongman. In his place sat an aging man in a suit, still unyielding. He refused to recognize the court, arguing it was a puppet of the occupiers. Yet as witnesses spoke of torture, mass executions and chemical attacks, even his former allies turned away. The trial lasted over a year. In November 2006, Saddam was found guilty for the Dujail massacre, the execution of 148 villagers after an assassination attempt on him in 1982. The sentence, death by hanging. At dawn, Saddam Hussein was led to a small chamber in Baghdad's Kadhimiya district. He refused a hood. Moments later, the man who once ruled Iraq for a quarter century was dead. Outside, fireworks and gunfire echoed, some in celebration, others in mourning. Iraq had rid itself of its dictator, but the peace he had promised in death never came. Power vacuums breed chaos. With Saddam gone, Iraq plunged into civil war. Sunni and Shia militias battled for control. The state he had ruled by fear collapsed into anarchy. From that chaos rose new forces, among them a group that would later call itself ISIS. For many Iraqis, life after Saddam became even more uncertain. The economy shattered, infrastructure destroyed, and trust between communities vanished. By the time US troops withdrew in 2011, hundreds of thousands were dead, millions displaced, and the dream of a united Iraq seemed distant. To some, Saddam Hussein remains the embodiment of tyranny, a ruthless dictator who plunged his nation into endless war. To others, especially those who remember Iraq's years of stability and power before 1990, he is remembered as a strong leader, undone by his own ambition. History rarely paints in black and white. Saddam's legacy endures, in the scars of his victims, in the ruins of his palaces, and in the lessons the world continues to learn about the cost of unchecked power. He once promised Iraq greatness. Instead, he left behind ghosts. In the end, Saddam Hussein's rule collapsed as suddenly as it began. He built an empire of loyalty, but it was loyalty born of fear, and fear fades quickly when the walls fall. His rise was a story of ambition, his rule a story of control. But his downfall was the story of a man who could not see beyond himself. Iraq still carries the weight of his shadow, in politics, in memory, and in the hearts of those who lived through his years. And yet amid the ruins, life continues. For history, no matter how dark, always moves forward. The tale of Saddam Hussein reminds us that power gained through fear is always borrowed. And when that debt comes due, no throne, no army, and no monument can stand against time.